Nothing is too wonderful to be true, if it be consistent with the laws of nature. So said acclaimed scientist Michael Faraday. Well, in the story we're going to read today from the book of Genesis, Yahweh one-ups Mr. Faraday, saying, "Is anything too wonderful for Yahweh?" Again, this summer and all the way through autumn, we get to not jump around the Hebrew Scriptures, his Christian Old Testament. We get to follow the Bible narrative chronologically, hitting most of the more important stories in order. Last week, we got introduced to Abram and Sarai, who at God's direction left their home and their security and traveled hundreds of miles to another land where, by the way, they spend the rest of their lives living as guests in a foreign land. And even though they're both well beyond the age of childbearing, God promises them descendants and land, and that they and their descendants will be a blessing to everyone in the entire world. Well, now, after that introduction to this couple, a lot of stuff has happened. In the second half of chapter 12, there's this weird episode where there's a famine, and Abram and Sarai travel to Egypt looking for some food to eat. And while they're there, Abram says, Sarai, you're a really beautiful woman, and I don't want these Egyptians to kill me in order to get you, so just tell everybody you're my sister. Don't tell them you're married to me. Kind of a weird story. After that, Abram and his nephew Lot separate. They decide to live in different places. Abram helps some of his Canaanite neighbors fight some battles, and this mysterious figure named Melchizedek visits Abram and blesses him. And then, yet again, God promises land and descendants to Abram, who says, "Yeah, I'd like some assurance of this, if you don't mind." So God says, "You betcha," and sends him this rather strange dream. Still, Abram and Sarai cannot get pregnant, so Sarai forces her enslaved servant Hagar to sleep with her husband so that Hagar can get pregnant and have a child by Abram, which will legally belong to Sarai, the mistress. But when they discover that Hagar is indeed pregnant, then Sarai gets jealous of Hagar, treats her so harshly that Hagar runs away out into the wilderness, where an angel comes to her and says, "Don't worry, God's got this. It's all going to work out all right. Go on back to the family." And she does, and she gives birth to a son named Ishmael. When the writer of this narrative tells us Abram was 86 years old. 13 years later, when Ishmael is growing into adulthood, Abram is 99 years old, and yet again, God reiterates the promises of land and descendants, and commands Abram to circumcise himself and all of the males in his tribe, and then changes the names of Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah. Also, God clarifies that it is Sarah herself who, by this time, the writer tells us, is 90 years old. She is the one who's going to bear a child for Abraham. And when Abraham hears this, he literally falls on his face laughing. So now we pick up with the story, the beginning of chapter 18. Yahweh appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour. Knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran off to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I be fruitful?" Yahweh said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for Yahweh? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "Well, I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Yes, you did laugh." And now we skip ahead in the story. For now, we'll come back to some of this, to the beginning of chapter 21 to bring this bit to a close. Yahweh dealt with Sarah as he had said, and Yahweh did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, which means he laughs, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, "God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And she said, "Who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." Okay, well, there are several things to wonder about here. For instance, Abraham was, according to the writer of this narrative, already 75 and Sarah 65 when God first promised them a child. That's already pushing things a bit. Now, there was a BBC News report just in 2023 about a 70-year-old Ugandan woman who gave birth, but that was after IVF treatment. But still, 65 years old, that's pushing it. But now it's been another 25 years. That's a long delay for an already questionable promise. And can we just acknowledge the injustice and, frankly, the ick of a young enslaved woman being forced by an older woman who owns her to sleep with the owner's even older husband? Nevertheless, interestingly, apparently God decides that it's not enough for this long-promised child to be Abraham's only. Yeah, I see what you did there. You got a child by the woman owned by your wife, but that's not my plan, my friend. God's plan is for the proper heir to be not only Abraham's son, but also Sarah's son. That's worth noting. It's also intriguing the way that Yahweh appears to Abraham here. It's very anthropomorphic. It's just three dudes, three guys who show up. One of them apparently is Yahweh, and the other two turn out to be angels. It's not the Holy Trinity. It's not Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's God and a couple of his angels. And interesting that God appears not as mighty ruler, but as mysterious guest. Reminds us of the importance of hospitality in that culture, where it could literally be endangering to your life to not receive hospitality in certain instances. And also intriguing that even here in the Hebrew Scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, God appears on earth in a way that demonstrates some vulnerability on earth. Several scholars point out that the first people to hear this episode would likely have perceived and enjoyed the comic elements of this story a lot more easily than we do, because we often take these stories so seriously and somberly. I mean, it's in the Bible. It has to be serious. But you'll notice that Abraham does a whole lot of running around and hastening. Got to run here, got to run there, hurrying to do all of these things. And but when he first invites the trio, he promises, "Why don't you just come rest in the shade? I'll bring you a little water. You can wash your feet, bring you a little bit of bread." And then look what he does. He rushes into Sarah and says, Quick, make some bread. Use 3 measures of flour, which apparently turns out to be 8.5 pounds of the finest flour. And apparently that would have made about 12 good-sized loaves. So what he brings eventually to his guests is 4 loaves each. Not to mention some curds and milk. And meanwhile, his servant is slaughtering and preparing a calf for the meal. How long does all of this take? And imagine all of that food set before them. You can see that there's an element of humor here, and how delightful to recover that can be part of our story. Speaking of the comedic nature of this, over the centuries, Christian preachers have certainly given Sarah way more grief than she deserves for laughing when she hears that she's going to get pregnant, even though it had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women, which is to say she was way beyond menopause. We don't know that her laugh was dismissive. It could just as easily have been nervous or incredulous or even joyful. Also, we just heard that when her husband learned that she was going to be pregnant, he literally fell on his face laughing. So let's give Sarah a bit of a break here. We also shouldn't assume that Yahweh is scolding her or rebuking her when he points out that she laughed. He could just as easily be saying that with a smile of his own and laughing along with her. And can we be adult here when we acknowledge that the implication is that Yahweh expects Sarah and Abraham to engage in the activities that are generally associated with producing a pregnancy? Also, several scholars point out that part that tickles Sarah when she says, "After I've grown old and my husband is old, shall I be fruitful?" Sure, it speaks of her being surprised that she's going to be able to get pregnant. But more than that, according to scholars such as the wonderful Reverend Will Gaffney in her Womanist Midrash on the Torah, notes that this is equivalent to Sarah pondering, "After I've been completely dried out, will there yet be for me wetness and sexual pleasure? And will her centenarian hubby be able to achieve then what today older fellas often look for little boo pills to assist them with?" There is delight, there is an earthiness to this. Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it has to be serious and somber and without earthiness and delight. And again, God does not rebuke Sarah, but hears her, assures her, maybe with a warm smile and a wink. Is anything too wonderful for Yahweh? I hope that you know that you belong, and I hope that you stay curious.